Welcome everybody to today's Fellows Colloquium. We are excited to have Hollis Robbins with us, as well as former fellow of the Hutchins Center, Greg Hekimovich, who will provide the introduction. Professor Hekimovich is chair of the English department at Furman University. He is the author of numerous books and articles, including a chapter in To Make Their Way in the World, The Enduring Legacy of the Zili Daguerreotypes, a co-publication of the Peabody Museum and Aperture. And forthcoming, and we're all excited about this, is his book, The Life and Times of Hannah Crafts. And so now the podium is yours, Professor Hekimovich. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Krishna. It's such a joy to be here with my good friend Hollis Robbins, who is a wonderful, amazing scholar. I want to share just a little bit of an introduction about Dr. Robbins. Dr. Hollis Robbins is Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities at Sonoma State University and a noted scholar of 19th century American and African American history and literature. Before coming to Sonoma State, Dean Robbins was chair of the Department of Humanities at Peabody Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And from 2014 to 2017, the director of Hopkins Center for Africana Studies. She's been a fellow at the National Humanities Center and was a 2014 winner of Johns Hopkins University's Alumni Association Excellence in Teaching. She's got all the skills: writing, teaching, administrating. Her newest book, which I'm thrilled we'll be talking about today, that didn't show up on the screen, but it's Forms of Contention, Influence and the African-American Sonnet Tradition. This explores the interrelationship of the influence, double consciousness, canon formation, and poetic form, and specifically looks at the sonnet. And we're going to hear a lot about that today. It's such a wonderful book. It's been a pleasure spending time with it this past week. Dr. Robbins has previously edited or co-edited 3 books with Henry Louis Gates Jr., including the Penguin Portable 19th Century African American Women Writers, named one of NPR's best books of 2017, and the Norton annotated Uncle Tom's Cabin. She's also the editor of In Search of Hannah Crafts, Essays on the Bondwoman's Narrative. She's co-edited with Paula Garrett the works of William Wells Brown. So all over the map of African American literature, she's made her presence and wonderful scholarship known. Dr. Robbins started noticing the work behind this project in the abundance of sonnets appearing in 19th and 20th century Black newspapers in 2004, when she began as director of the Black Periodical Literature Project. So this is a deeply researched, deeply archival work that she, again, is bringing to us as an audience. There are hundreds of sonnets published on contemporary events, on King Tut, on the boxer Jack Johnson, on lynching, on Black soldiers returning from the war. While there's been a great deal of anthologizing of Black poetry and scholarship on particular poems and poets, there was almost no scholarship on Black sonnets or how Black sonnet writers have been responding to each other for over 100 years. This new work that she's going to share with us today does this important work for us. So I'm very happy to introduce my friend Hollis Robbins.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you so much for your enthusiasm. It's been kind of funny over this the past 15 years in writing this book, having to drum up enthusiasm for the sonnet form. So I'm really appreciative of that. I'm going to see if I can share screen here, because what I wanted to do, and thank you for Krishna and Skip and Abby for inviting me to give this presentation today, and thank you everybody for coming. I'm really delighted to talk about my work and to talk about Black sonnets. So it's really a gift and a pleasure to be here. By the way, just the most important thing about this book, grab it off the shelf here, is that it's dedicated to Henry Louis Gates. And it was the most important thing when I was writing this book, is realizing how important his scholarship has been to the book and to the opportunity as managing editor of the Black Periodical Literature Project back in 2004 to have the opportunity to work with these newspapers and really discover and come across this archive. So thank you particularly for that, Skip. Okay, so I'm going to see if I can share screen. So here we are, back where we were, forms of contention, influence. So I wanted to, when I first came on this project, I wanted to ask a couple of questions, 5 questions, which is the first is the politics of form, like the extent to which form can be neutral. Is influence necessarily a bad thing? I was looking a lot at questions of what influences poetry, and what is the relationship of influence to signifying. I was interested in canon formation and the changing idea of appropriate. What would be an appropriate form for Black poetry? This came up in things that I was reading. Scholarship of influence within the African American canon, and what is in the newspaper archives. And I should frame this by saying, as Skip knows, that I was late to be a scholar of African American literature. And don't do this at home. I changed my field to African American literature after finishing my dissertation at Princeton. I was going to be a scholar of Victorian novels, of Dickens, and 19th century American novels as well. And meeting Skip and moving into African American literature, I came at the questions of how to approach this literature, which was now my field, in, I think, fundamental ways. And Skip would be like, ask this question, read this. So these are some of the questions that I was interested in answering. And this question of appropriate form has been a leitmotif in Black poetry scholarship. And there were 2 competing ideas that I wanted to play with, Blyde and Jackson in Black Poetry in America, saying, the story of Black poetry begins with a Black poet's search for a language. Language is a medium of appropriate diction through which he can represent himself without demeaning his own concept of what he is. And in questions, it wasn't a lot of questions about what is an appropriate form. And even in sort of mainstream poetic scholarship, the questions of form are not always front and center. They're sort of to the side. But J.F. Cunningham's book, The Problem of Form, sort of proposes that form is what remains when everything else is changed. It's a Platonic position. It's mathematical, like the linguistic notion of a squared minus 2 squared, right? What is A and B? It's just a formula, right? So it's a formula that potentially is without politics. And this question of form is, one of the oldest questions in Black poetry, going back to the very first Black poetry anthology, James Weldon Johnson's, from 1922. And he writes in the preface, what the colored poem did in the United States needs to do is something like what Synge did. I think I'm pronouncing that right this time, Skip. What Synge did for the Irish. He needs to find a form that will express the racial spirit by symbols from within rather than symbols from without. He needs a form expressing the imagery, the idiom, the particular turns of thought, and the distinctive humor and pathos of the Negro, but which will also be capable of voicing the deepest, highest emotions and aspirations, and allow of the widest range of subjects and the widest scope of treatment. So again, trying to think through where the sonnet fit in here. And I kept reading over and over how the Black sonnet is an incongruous form. It doesn't work. Like Langston Hughes. Certainly the Shakespearean sonnet would be no mold in which to express the life of Beale Street or of Lenox Avenue. Amiri Baraka, who was more than anybody else tried to put get the sonnet out of Black poetry, said, I'm not interested in writing sonnets, sestinas, or anything, only poems. If the poem has got to be a sonnet, unlikely though, or whatever, it'll certainly let me know. And Stephen Henderson, editor of a great anthology of Black poetry in the 70s, said, the Black ballad is blacker than the sonnet, but both are less black than the blues. And Gwendolyn Brooks, probably the most, my favorite poet, the extraordinary poet of the 20th century, for whom the sonnet is, is a really important form, after being beaten down by poetry criticism, said, all right, no more sonnets. I'm not going to burn any of those I've written, but I just feel that Blacks should be trying to develop some Black styles for themselves. And in listening to poets, especially poets who write about sonnets now, and I begin my book with an anecdote of going to see Natasha Trethewey give a talk in North Carolina, in Durham, at Duke, when she's talking about her poetry, and she's well known for her sonnets, and always engages with the Audre Lorde quote, "The master's tool will not dismantle the master's house." This question of whether the sonnet is the master's tools. And after talking about the sonnet and after engaging with this question and apologizing for writing in the sonnet, because, the sonnet is this white form, I raised my hand and I said, what about this century? Actually, more than a century, almost 200 years, 250 years, if you count one poem by Phyllis Wheatley, a 14-line poem that you could read as a sonnet. What about all these Black sonnet writers over the centuries? When is it the master's tools if Black poets have been writing sonnets for all this time, and really rich, interesting sonnets? When does the sonnet become a Black form? Houston Baker wrote about formal poetry as mastered masks, as a Black content in white envelopes. Well, how would we begin to think about the sonnet form as not a white envelope and not a master's tool? So I started looking at the canon of Black sonnets, which is huge. And I know this is hard to read, and it's in my book. I just kind of went through every anthology that was published in the 20th century, starting with James Weldon Johnson, and looked to see what sonnets were well known enough to be published in anthologies. And this is sort of a glimpse, it's a tiny tip of the iceberg of the huge numbers that are published once in the archive, and I'll mention some of them. But, James Weldon Johnson publishes a whole bunch of sonnets, including his own, Mother Night, and a whole bunch by Claude McKay. Richard Curlin, the next important anthology, publishes, again, some of the usual suspects that we'll see. James Carruthers, Claude McKay, Leslie Pinckney Hill, James Weldon Johnson, a 1924 anthology. Again, we've got some Paul Dunbar, Leslie Pinckney Hill, James Weldon Johnson, Claude McKay. And we see a certain canon of Black sonnets appearing over and over again. And Langston Hughes and Arna Bontomp's first big poetry anthology in 1949 is just lousy with sonnets, with just sonnets everywhere, from James Carruthers, James Weldon Johnson, Stanley Braithwaite, Leslie Pinckney Hill, Gwendolyn Bennett, County Cullen, down to, of course, Claude McKay. It's like you can't have a Black poetry anthology without Claude McKay's sonnets. Here's some more through the 50s and 60s. And even Stephen Henderson, way down at the bottom, Understanding the New Black Poetry, includes, and I think it's cut off there, but that's some of the Black sonnets that he has there, including Claude McKay, County Cullen, Robert Hayden, Margaret Walker, and James Emanuel. So you see, there is a canon. As incongruous as the sonnet is, there is a canon here. And just Sonnet 101, just look at the sonnet as a blueprint. The Petrarchan sonnet is the ABBA, poetic turn, CDE, or CCDDEE. It's the Petrarchan form, invented by Petrarch and others in 12th century Italy. And it's a kind of Platonic, Neoplatonic idea of metaphysical love. It's usually like, oh, you fair maiden, and it's always a fair maiden. You fair maiden, I love you, but I can't have you. It's a problem and a resolution. It's a crisis and a resolution. And this poetic turn in the middle, this volta, signals a change in the poetic voice and a change with rhyme scheme. And when it migrated to England in the 16th century, a little bit earlier, fewer rhymes in English. So Shakespeare famously came up with or developed another form, A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, and then poetic turn, G, G. There's always usually or often a poetic turn also after the octave, which is after the first eight, before the sestet. And even in here in the Shakespearean sonnet, it's double voiced, right? The sonnet by its nature is double voiced. This, but this, I'm this, but this. And this seemed very provocative to me after reading Du Bois and Souls of Black Folk and the notion of double consciousness, the two-ness. Du Bois talks about, how does a poetic form that is developed to express two-ness, how does this matter to the Black poetic tradition? And I've just thrown in there Sonnet 18, Shall I Compare Thee to the Summer's Day? Because it's, just to have an example of a poem and a famous poem, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? And the notion of the sun, the question of the gold complexion and fairness you will see when I started looking at a through line of Black sonnets, this notion of the summer and the sun and fairness and the gold complexion and fighting against that tradition was a key part of the Black sonnet tradition. I have a master's degree down the street at the Kennedy School of Government, and the rule was in any presentation you should have a Venn diagram. And if you go to a presentation and you don't get your Venn diagram, you should ask for your money back. So here's my Venn diagram. In thinking about African American sonnets, my research question, I wanted to look at the sonnet tradition, and I wanted to look at the African American literary tradition and see where they overlapped. And here's, again, looking at the sonnet concerns. I looked at everything I could read about the sonnet as a form. David Bromwich's books. I mean, there's just so many books on the sonnets, read every single one, right? And it's really about Petrarch, the notion of metaphysical courtly love versus fleshly love, right? It's the metaphysical versus the flesh, about what Shakespeare brought to the table, what Milton brought to the table in the 17th century by reconnecting with the Petrarchan tradition to turn it from love poetry to protest poetry. The nature of iambic pentameter, what does this mean as a kind of form versus tetrameter? The idea that the sonnet is privileged. There's a certain gentility about this. And what does this mean in the 20th century with the turn to modernism, right? Can the sonnet be modern? And what does this privileged position mean? And the African American poetry concerns, I just began reading everything, in African American poetry scholarship, the concerns, authenticity, slavery and race violence, appropriateness, what is an appropriate form? The blues tradition, the spirituals tradition, the idea that it should be organically Black, African, what does African rhythms move into this question? And then in the 60s, the Black aesthetic and the Black arts movement. How to wrench something away from European roots. And in this place of overlap, some really provocative concepts, which is that a sonnet is about being a slave to love, but the notions of slavery and fetters and bondage are all over sonnets. Sonnets in the white sonnet tradition, the European sonnet tradition. A sonnet is a scanty plot of ground. There's 14 lines, that's it. Sometimes 15, sometimes 13, but that's it. And poets have long complained, like, if I write a sonnet, I got to get everything into this tiny plot of ground. A sonnet is about the dead leaves of tradition. It's about writing something new when there's so much written. Exactly this. How do I write something new in a traditional way? A sonnet is about bondage and chains. And there's just so many sonnets that complain about being chained to this form, that when you're writing a form, it's got to be iambic pentameter. It's got to be 14 lines. It's got to have a particular rhyme scheme. You're chained before you even start writing your sonnet. A sonnet is a cage. And also, the sonnet speaks in two voices. It has double consciousness. And all of these things are really interesting for both sonnet writers and Black poetry. But this issue of complaining about the sonnet's appropriateness was also done within the sonnet tradition. And I want to read quickly this John Keats's poem on the sonnet from 1818. If by dull rhymes our English must be chained, and like Andromeda the sonnet sweet fettered, in spite of pained loveliness, let us find out if we must be constrained. Sandals more interwoven and complete to fit the naked foot of poesy. Let us inspect the lyre and weigh the stress of every chord and see what may be gained by ear industrious and attention meet. Misers of sound and syllables, no less than Midas of his coinage. Let us be jealous of dead leaves in the bay wreath crown. So if we may not let the muse be free, she will be bound with garlands of her own. And it's an important poem in sonnet scholarship by John Keats, a kind of outsider to the Romantic tradition, a Cockney, not educated at Oxford and Cambridge, thinking like, where do I fit into British poetry? What can I do with a sonnet as an outsider? And after emancipation and the rise and the establishment of Black colleges and universities, when we see a generation of early sonnet writers who are college educated and have read their Shelley and have read their Milton and read their Wordsworth and read their Keats, were often drawn to Keats as an outsider and knew this sonnet very well. And you can see the influence through the sonnet tradition. Early Black sonnets in newspapers, I'm going to be jumping around a little bit and then weave these strands together. Early Black sonnets in newspapers, particularly by Leslie Pinckney Hill, who was Du Bois really liked and kept asking to write sonnets. The first poem that Du Bois published in the Crisis after it was established in 1911 was a sonnet. By Leslie Pinckney Hill. And this is another one called Vision of a Lyncher. And it's a sonnet that's written for the Crisis and dedicated to His Excellency, the Governor of South Carolina, because of his lynching policies. And I'm not going to read this one, but it's not a great sonnet, frankly. But it's his attempt to say the sonnet form, how is the sonnet form appropriate to write about lynching? And the point of this poem is the governor of South Carolina going to hell and the devil kicking him out because he's just too bad even for hell. But I wanted to give an example of how sonnets, began to be everywhere in Black newspapers in the 20th century and in the 19th as well. And one of the things that you'll notice, and when I bring up some images of sonnets from Black newspapers, is they fit really nicely into a column. So one of the interesting aspects of why there are so many Black sonnets in Black newspapers is they fit. And Charles Johnson, the editor of Opportunity, had written, I think, to Langston Hughes, is like, yeah, send me some sonnets because they fit so well at the end of a column, which is just, in thinking about the influence of why poets might choose this form, it's just easier to get published, which is kind of funny. A maybe more interesting sonnet by Leslie Pinckney Hill is, and again, not a great sonnet, but you can see what he's doing here in trying to marry the sonnet form with Black poetry. To a caged canary in a Negro restaurant. And if I were doing this in person, I would be pointing at people and having people read these, but since I'm here, I'll do it. Thou little golden bird of happy song, a cage cannot restrain the rapturous joy which thou dost shed abroad. Thou dost employ thy bondage for high uses. Grievous wrong is thine, yet in thy heart grows full and strong the tropic sun, though far beyond thy flight, and though thou flutterest there by day and night above the clamor of a dusky throng. So let my will, albeit hedged about by creed and caste, feed on the light within. So let my song sing through the bars of doubt with light and healing where despair has been. So let my people bide their time and place, a hindered but a sunny-hearted race. And, there's a lot to say about this poem, and it's a complicated poem. And I will talk. I'm happy to talk more about this, but I bring it here to say that this is, Leslie Pinckney Hill after Du Bois did so much to try to make the sonnet work for Black poetry, and the cage, the song, the bondage, the real bondage, right? The actual cage, right? And this is what Black sonnet writers do, is say this metaphysical cage of the sonnet. Let's read it here as a real cage. The golden bird and the golden sun. We see the sun here. You see the sort of same words that appear in the sonnet tradition coming here in this poem. And I want to read probably the single most successful Black sonnet, which is Claude McKay's "If We Must Die." And again, I'll read it. I wish somebody else would read it, but I'll read it here. If we must die. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. And you see this poem is published, it's in The Liberator in 1919, the Red Summer of 1919. Contextually, it is a sonnet that is fighting against race violence, in outrage. And he chooses the sonnet form in ways that evoke Shakespeare, in ways that evoke the Milton protest sonnet. He knows his sonnets. He's been trained in sonnets. This poem was read at pulpits around the country, in Black pulpits around the country, for weeks after it was published. This was just traveled so widely because it's really a great poem and a great sonnet. It is not racialized. And famously, apocryphally, there were stories that circulated throughout the 20th century that Winston Churchill had recited this poem in Parliament. There's no actual proof of this, but Melvin Tolson and others, when they write about McKay, always mention that Winston Churchill recited this poem, not knowing it was a Black poet. So it continues to circulate. And the poem famously was on the wall at Attica, which is true. But you see this poem partaking of the sonnet tradition and partaking of the Black poetry tradition. And so it's no accident that this poem continues to be anthologized and is kind of, you've got to have it in Black poetry anthologies, and, certainly pushes back against the idea of incongruity. Another Black poet, a Jamaican poem, Edward Bois, comes at this question of the abstract, the fair maiden, in this wonderful sonnet, There's a Brown Girl in the Ring. When I speak of this woman, I do not mean to indicate the muse or abstract queen, but to record the brown fact of her being, the undiluted blackness of her hair, and that I lightly kissed her knee, and how her feet were shy before my stare. It may be that I praise her memory here because she is indeed but allegory, of meanings greater than herself or me, of which I am instinctively aware. But may such meetings never be a care for that fine head, and may my glory be that blood and brain responded well to slim, shy feet and smoothest knees and most black hair. And I love the poem, the structure of the poem is that, again, he knows his sonnet tradition, and he puts the sestet first and the octave later. He literally turns this sonnet tradition on its head, like, hell to this fair maiden. I'm going to record the brown fact of this maiden. And he begins with, even though it's a Petrarchan sonnet in some ways, or Shakespearean, and he turns it upside down. He begins with a couplet, right? Mean and queen. And he's engaging specifically with this tradition. And this, in poetics, feet of the meter, when a poet uses feet, the poet is also engaging with this poetic tradition. And it's this idea of the feet were shy before my stare, the idea that the sonnet tradition was shy, or I was shy before the sonnet tradition. But he takes the sonnet tradition, takes this blueprint, and makes it appropriate for what he's doing here. And you can't really understand this poem without understanding the sonnet tradition that he's engaging with. Gwendolyn Brooks, some earlier, does a new kind of engagement with the same tradition, but more of a Shakespeare Summer's Day tradition, and from a woman's perspective, right? I'm not just the fair maiden up in the tower. I'm here. So this poem, which gets anthologized a lot, Intermission 1, Deep Summer, you can see engaging with these questions as well. By all things planetary, sweet, I swear, those hands may not possess these hands again until I get me gloves of ice to wear, because you are the headiest of men. Your speech is whiskey and your grin is gin. I'm well drunken. Is there water near? I've need of wintry air to crisp me in. But come here, let me put this in your ear. I would not want them now. You gave me this wildness to gulp. Now water is too pale. And now I know deep summer is a bliss I have no wish for weathering the gale. So when I beg for gloves of ice to wear, laugh at me, I am lying, sweet, I swear. And we can come back and talk about this poem, but she's clearly, again, engaging with this tradition from the position of the woman and from the position of a Black woman, even if it's not overtly racist. Your speech is whiskey and your grin is gin. It's like, you're out there in this sort of metaphysical, poetic thing. And she, putting this in her ear, again, evoking Shakespeare, of having language be influential in this particular way. And water is too pale. So it's a sonnet, which again is within this tradition of the sonnet tradition to make it her own. And more than anyone else, I would say, in the 20th century, Gwendolyn Brooks owns the sonnet. And when I asked Natasha Trethewey, as I write in my book, why she keeps talking about the tradition as a European tradition, how many poets have to be writing, Black poets have to write sonnets before their influence on each other is acknowledged. Natasha Trethewey stopped and said, you know what, you're right. I can't say that anymore. I learned the sonnet from Gwendolyn Brooks. And I think it was deeply meaningful and also a little bit awkward, but important, right? The sonnet, even while it's engaging with this form, is so important for the African-American poetry tradition. And I want to move quickly to a poem that I found in an anthology, and I was looking just through Black poetry anthologies, and this poem by Amiri Baraka, back when he was still Leroy Jones, Epistrophe, is a sonnet. And he wrote 2 sonnets, and I checked them both with Nate Mackey, the great poet. And I said, are these sonnets? He came to lunch at the National Humanities Center. And I said, and he looked at them and he said, yeah, they're sonnets. And he put it out on Facebook the next day. And he said, I never noticed these are sonnets, but they're sonnets. So this one, Epistrophe, it's such a static reference, looking out the window all the time, the eye's limits, on good days, the sun. And what you see here in New York, walls and buildings, or in the hidden gardens of opulent queens, profusion, endless stretches of leisure. It's like being chained to some dead actress, and she keeps trying to tell you something horribly maudlin, e.g., the leaves are flat and motionless. What I know of the mind seems to end here, just outside my face. I wish some weird-looking animal would come along. I love this poem. And it's, for me, I'm reading it right smack in the middle of the sonnet tradition, from the beginning in the tower, right? Looking out at the sun, uh, and the evocation early on walls and buildings and hidden gardens, these images that are part of the sonnet tradition, and opulent queens, and endless stretches of leisure, the sort of Petrarchan tradition of sitting around and writing poems to opulent queens. And they're maudlin, right? And it's like being trained to some dead actress. And then the Keats illusion, the leaves are flat and motionless, right? These are the dead leaves of traditions. And I wish some weird looking animal would come along, right? And soon after that, he calls from new poetic forms, poetic black foams. I wish some weird looking animal would come along. Anyway, this is how I read the poem, and I'm lovely to talk about it. This is another one. I'll skip over this and we can return to it, which is another Amiri Baraka poem called The Turncoat. And a kind of funny version of the Edmund Bois poem, Gingerbread Mama, which is clearly a sonnet. I love you, gingerbread mama, all sweet and brown. Love you more than tired boys loved collard greens and candied yams, more than new watermelons do the sun. Before you, I was older and owned a sky of sleep. And not even cowboy dreams were poets enough to wish me you. Now in brownness warm, everything is everything, and our forms move in soft affirmations, trying not to wake up the sun. And he's clearly operating in the tradition of the sonnet obad, the morning sonnet, the sonnet to the sun, and the idea of our forms, right? Our poetic forms as our forms moved in soft affirmations. And what's interesting, what I'm trying to do is just engage this through line of Black sonnets, this through line of sonnets that are never read together. What I wanted to do is bring them together. Everything is sort of sprinkled about in the anthologies, and that the scholarship doesn't bring sonnets together and say, how are they talking to each other? How are they talking traditions? Did Daughtry Long read Edward Baum? They both read Amiri Baraka. They all read Claude McKay. They all read Paul Dunbar. Like, how did each of them influence the sonnet of each other? And this is obvious in the great Terence Hayes poet, 2002, right? And it's sublime to read it. We slice the watermelon into smiles. 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 It's so amazing, this poem. And he was kind enough to not make me have to pay to include it in the book. I was like, I'm not going to write this book. I'm happy to pay for rights. He said, no, take the sonnet, because he wanted his sonnet in this collection, in this book. Just a couple of things about Black influence on Black poetry, and then I'll open it up to questions and discussion. I'm very interested in what folks are thinking. Paul Dunbar, in 1903, or at the end of the turn of the century, was, I claim, the first absolutely virtuoso Black sonnet writer who took the sonnet and was not trying to imitate something, but really engaged in something new. And his sonnet to Douglas, is mind blowing. It's great. Douglas, we have fallen on evil days. Such days as thou, not even thou, didst know, when thee, the eyes of that harsh long ago, saw salient at the cross of devious ways, and all the country heard thee with amaze. Not ended then the passionate ebb and flow, the awful tide that battled to and fro. We ride amid a tempest of dispraise. Now when the waves of swift dissension swarm, and honor, the strong pilot, lieth stark, oh, for thy voice high sounding o'er the storm, for thy strong arm to guide the shivering bark, the blast-defying power of thy form to give us comfort through the lonely dark. And it's a poem that is often noted to have been evoking Wordsworth's poem, London 1802, which says, Milton, you should be living at this hour. So, Dunbar is looking at that tradition to write to Douglas. But what I want to look at is here, jumping quickly to this question of influence, right? And what does it mean, to have poems, I don't know why I put this right here, but I put this right here because I want to go to something else with that sonnet. And just looking through the newspapers and looking at the questions of how Black poets influenced each other, not just Black sonnet writers, not just going back and reading white poems and taking those forms and that blueprint and making it appropriate, but are there enough sonnets that aren't canonized yet? That actually may talk about how different new ways that this is for the next generation of scholars to go through the Black newspapers and pick out these sonnets and say, okay, are there traditions of influence going on? The little bit that I did in my book show that absolutely there are. So these are two sonnets from the Chicago Defender that aren't published anywhere else. Right? They only exist here, including, I'm going to have to escape this a little bit because I have to be able to read it, including this poem, this Gwendolyn Brooks sonnet, right? It's not anthologized anywhere. It's only here. And it's really, and it's an extraordinary poem. It's a little small here. I've looked at the lucid star too long, a star that I can't read it. A star that so, why can't I see this? That so outgleams its company, though its companions are a lustrous throng. It cannot be of them, it seems to me. It glimmers vividly across the sky, a wondrous thing of milky silver light, sudden of radiance that can never die. Its ray is lamp enough for all the night. But not for me its opulescent glow, and not for me its lofty majesty, its richness, its magnificence. I know that such a star was never meant for me. Then God, why have you thrust it in my sight? Why blind me with this brilliance all too bright? It's really, let me try to get this here from here. It's come on. Slideshow, play from the beginning. Why it's really kind of interesting to me, why this, nobody's brought this in, or it needs to be brought into conversation. And here's another one. Again, you could see how the sonnets fit so well. This is also from the Chicago Defender. These three sonnets for Beatrice, right? Famously Petrarch, Laura, Dante, Beatrice. I think I'm getting the names right. That she's writing in this tradition, and these have not been republished anywhere. Right. And, it's in part sonnets within that tradition, but she's trying to do something which is very much foundational for her later work, and they need to be recovered and read against each other. And looking at the question of Black sonnet influence of each other, I went back to look at, the ways that Robert Hayden's famous Frederick Douglass poem draws upon the Dunbar poem. And again, this just doesn't get talked about enough. Like, his sonnet, Frederick Douglass, appears in anthologies, is discussed about the various versions that he wrote before he gets to this one. But when you read it together with this one, and I'm going to have to escape it a little bit so I can read it here. When it is finally ours, let me pull this out. When it is finally ours, this liberty, this beautiful and terrible thing, needful to man as air, usable as earth, when it belongs at last to our children, when it is truly instinct, brain matter, diastole, systole, reflex action, when it is finally won, when it is more than gaudy mumbo jumbo of politicians, this man, this Douglas, this former slave, this Negro beaten to his knees, exiled, visioning a world where none is lonely, none hunted, alien, this man, superb in love and logic, this man shall be remembered. Oh, not with statues' rhetoric, not with legends and poems and wreaths of bronze alone, but with the lives grown out of his life, the lives fleshing his dream of the needful, beautiful thing. It's such a fantastic poetry. I could talk about this forever. But what's so interesting is the way that it engages with Douglas's poem or with the sonnet tradition, and that O in the 11th line. That O matters, right? Let me just play from current slide here. That O matters. Right, he's talking to Douglas's poem. So what does that, to Dunbar's poem? So what does that mean about sonnet influence among Black poets? And then I want to end for now with this this great poem by Gerald Early on called Standards Volume 1 for workers massacred in a supermarket in Black St. Louis. As the detective pushed through the doors, the opening chords of Stardust came to him. As he walked around the blown blood and bits, looked at each body lying near the counter where often welfare checks were cashed and women grunted like swine, he felt something shudder in his back, saying, "Now you know." The song Stardust began to grow in him, strain by strain, old Hoagie's tune, as he kneeled among the bodies, not even thinking of the strange Holocaust here, when someone from the neighborhood tapped his shoulder. "Will they close the store? I can't go no other place." He could faintly hear the baby's cry, barking, feel the faint half moon. The strange tune, another one spoke up to be whistling for the dead. Startled, he turned, shrugging. "Standards go with anything," he said. It's such an awesome sonnet, and again, he's breaking all the traditions of rhyme scheme. He's breaking the traditions of iambic pentameter. It's about as inappropriate. He does the same reversal, the 6 and the 8 rather than the 8 and the 6. But in terms of appropriateness of this sonnet form to the content, standards go with anything, he says. And then just the other day, I had a chance to listen to Giovanni Singleton, the great poet, and her poem Birdcage, or Untitled Birdcage. And I asked her, I said, is this a sonnet? Because if you can count up the lines of the cage, right? And she was coy. She didn't quite answer. But as far as I am, I'm considering this a kind of sonnet. And then just to end up here with Tyehimba Jess, who won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize. The thing is about sonnets that they're long enough to say something and short enough to get to the point. At this point in our history, sonnets can be unrhymed and all kinds of stuff. 14 lines, oh, it's a sonnet. It's got this kind of elasticity to it. And the rhyme scheme can be as strict as you want it to be and as loose as you want it to be. And I'll stop there interested in thoughts about the Black sonnet tradition and about poetry in general. So thank you.
Wow. Bravo.
Thank you.
Oh my God, that was fabulous.
Now you don't have to read the book, Skip.
I just got the Cliff Note version. Greg, excellent introduction. So passionate, so energetic, as Hollis said. Thank you. I'd like to offer you the chance to pose the first question to Hollis.
Thank you, Skip. Hollis, that was brilliant, as is the book. And I think this question really plays along with what is so unique and valuable what you did in this book, and that is bringing these sonnets into their richer context. And your presentation did this so lovingly too. The way these isolated poems, as we've experienced them in anthologies, are even that much richer. They stand on their own, but they're so rich in the context in which you place them. And I really think this is a major contribution to this field. My question's this, because I think it's hinted at, and you may explore this further, but I invite you to respond. The periodic context for many of these poems being published because they fit the space of the newspapers. And that is a tradition that seems to invite a type of dialogue, and you do that really well in the presentation, showing how in the same paper, these are selected pieces that have this dialogue. I wonder if you would reflect a little bit more, share with the audience a little bit more how the vehicle of periodic publication helps augment your design to draw the context more forward.
That's a hard question, because in some ways, when I'm kind of looking at, okay, you starting with the fact of these just, hundreds and thousands of Black sonnets, like, okay, what's up with this? How is it there are so many? How are they operating? What are the inputs that led to this output? Right? And the multiple inputs led to this output. The first input was that an entire new generations of Black poets who had gone to college, right? And suddenly, were taking classes, so that Frank Yerby, for example, who was mostly known for the Foxes of Harrow and his kind of bodice ripper novels, went to Fisk. In the Fisk English department, just the head professor there, I'm forgetting his name right now, was such a Shelley scholar or a Shelley fan. And so they just read Percy Bysshe Shelley sonnets over and over and over again. And what you saw throughout the early 20th century is poets, and they're not always great, sending poems in to these journals because they were asked to write them in high school, right? Like, write a sonnet. That was what you had to do in school. You had to write a sonnet. You had to write a sonnet. And so in terms of what these inputs are, and I in my book, I identify two traditions. And I didn't want to call the tradition like the good tradition and the not so good tradition. So I call it, sort of the foreground, the canonical tradition of poets like Dunbar, like Gwendolyn Brooks, who take the sonnet form and its double voicedness and this history seriously for this, to make something new with a form. This background tradition is the tradition that's just everywhere in newspapers that are just publishing this stuff, and theorizing, like somebody like Cordelia Ray, who published the first book of sonnets, a Black poet in 1893, publishes the first book of sonnets called Sonnets. And, she's a fairly well-known writer. She's Black publishing royalty from the Ray family. She writes the poem Lincoln on for the inauguration at the Lincoln Memorial, right? And this stuff is the kind of stuff that Langston Hughes and poems in the Harlem Renaissance, like, we're not going to write about that anymore, right? This stuff is just genteel and it's high blown and it's kind of And so the throwing out of the sonnet tradition is the throwing out of this sonnet tradition, of the kind of high school assignment, genteel sonnet tradition. The second kind, the double voice taking it seriously, what I argue is kind of needs this, right? Like Gwendolyn Brooks needs to write. We all go through apprenticeships. You need to write these not so great things before you write the great things. Like Paul Dunbar's early sonnets are, they're kind of meh. Leslie Pinckney Hills, he's got some good ones, he's got some not so good ones. Georgia Douglas Johnson has some, and then she gets to some really good ones. So you need this market, right? You need this market, like, we'll take them, you'll publish them. And then over time, taking this form seriously is when you get to this brilliance. So that's kind of the long answer to the question.
How does this act of reclamation that you're doing, I always tell our students that the mixed blessing or curse of a scholar of African-American literature is that you have to resurrect the text before you explicate it.
I tweeted
so,
that. I quoted you. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And you're in an act of a grand act of reclamation. Mm-hmm. How would you ideally like to see the restoration of the sonnet form to its proper place in the history of African-American letters affect the arc of the canon, the arc of the tradition? It's as if people have forgotten it. I mean, in our Norton anthology, I'm sure we have some sonnets.
Oh, you have. You do. You have the good ones.
But you can't do one without If We Must Die. You can't do an anthology, and you can't do it without Robert Hayden. But you have a lot that in our next edition, should be there. Why is the sonnet form important to you? Why is it important to African-American literature? And how does it change what we see or think when we hear the term the African-American literary tradition?
Thank you. And that is the question. So I was trying to, acknowledge my privilege in writing this book, and to say, not be a kind of scold a little bit, but ended up feeling a little scoldy in my 6th chapter on canon formation in the 1960s, right? There were all of these anthologies. There was all of these books. There's a woman named Beatrice Murphy who writes these incredible anthologies, or collects these incredible anthologies of poets and sonnets that I'd never heard of. And she gets singled out in the 1960s in Black World, the Negro Digests that are reviewing these books. So it's like, does this woman even realize she's Black, right? This is not speaking to us, right? And really throwing out, it was the 6th chapter of my book's called Power Lines. It's about how, over and over again, anybody writing sonnets was made to feel bad for writing sonnets, and that all of the new anthologies were throwing out these sonnets, were saying that these sonnets that were not part of Black poetry were referring to, and I think it's interesting, referring to Harlem Renaissance, and particularly County Cullen and James Carruthers and these guys as the developmental phase of Black writing. And Black writers had to go through this, unfortunate developmental phase before blossoming now. And what that meant was just a throwing out. And I felt a little bit bad calling it a throwing out of ancestors. But as a matter of poetic ancestors, these ancestors are there, they're living, and they really ought to be respected because they're interesting. And again, there's a lot of bad sonnets. And, even the sonnets to King Tut and the sonnets to Jack Johnson are a little bit goofy and kind of partake a little bit of somebody in high school is like, okay, the teacher wants me to write a sonnet. I'm going to write a sonnet on Jack Johnson, and gets it published. And it's great. And it should be part of this tradition. So I'd like to see, it's a little scoldy, but I think talking back to the 1960s canon that push these things to a side is important for these works.
Oh, absolutely. Critique is essential. People made a lot of ridiculous assertions about the tradition. It's ironic that Hayden, who wrote, as you say, the greatest sonnet probably of any African-American poet, published in 1966, which is the same year the Black arts movement basically is born. But they threw the baby out with the bath, and people made all kind of senseless claims about what's Black and what's not. It was stupid. And stupid, stupid, that is the word. And it's important for us as scholars to go back and critique it. You can explain why they did it, reducing forms as white, but they ended up writing in other white forms, so as well as imitating the blues and jazz. But the sonnet is enormously elastic, plastic, and can contain legions.
It can contain the opulent gardens. Did I convince you on that, on the Amiri Baraka sonnet, that it was in fact a sonnet?
Oh yeah, no question. He was such a well-educated person, and a great poet, and some of his poetics, as it were, his theories of literature, I know that he didn't believe, that he was too sophisticated to believe some of the things that he allowed himself to write and publish about, well, first, the Black arts movement and what was Black, quote unquote, what was not. And then more nakedly, perhaps, when he was a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, as he described himself, and then it was nuance and sophistication went out the window. Anyway, let's open it up. Krishna, are you curating?
Yes. Greg, do you have further comments or questions before we move on to the audience?
Yeah, I want to move to the audience questions so that they can get.
I want to say, if I can, I want to jump into one thing, and I think in part my interest in this comes out of how I got into this field, right, with the bondswoman's narrative and looking at how Hannah Crafts, in writing the bondswoman's narrative, turns to Dickens' description of the London slum, right, to write her own experience. And again, it's such a provocative but a little bit controversial idea, right? That if you speak from your own voice and your own authenticity, why are you reaching to this white writer, right? It happened to be a writer that Douglas was like, everybody should read. You should read your Dickens. You should read, because he understands how to give voice and language and description to the poor and the oppressed, right? So it always struck me as really extraordinary that she's hearing, now that we know from Greg that he's hearing Dickens and not reading Bleak House. She takes that language and makes it her own, right? And so getting back to this question of influence or signifying, right, is how is it when you're coming up with something new or speaking your own truth, as we all talk about now, right? What to use and change the model is not the master's tool, right? I think that this blueprint of how to do it not transcends, but grounds, undergirds the forms of doing this. And the fact that Black sonnet writers either taught or found or over time recognized that this form that engages with metaphysics versus the fleshly, that bounds you and constrains you in ways that, for example, with Gwendolyn Brooks, how she just slams through some of these sonnets, like writes for Cousin Vitt, with enjambment. Like she won't stop at the end of a line. It's like, this does not hold me. And he writes this great poet to Cousin Vitt, this woman is so vital, the sonnet can't hold her, but she's got to write this sonnet as a sonnet in order to show Cousin Vitt breaking out of the sonnet tradition, right? So it becomes a really useful tool. So anyway, my beginnings, thank you again, Skip, to this tradition comes at, what is going on here and why are these questions being asked?
Thank you. Should I go to a couple of the questions from the audience?
Yes, please.
Niall Monroe says, Professor Robbins, in your excellent book, you mentioned numerous sonnets by Dunbar, Hayden, and others which deal with predominantly white Civil War era figures, such as Robert Gould Shaw, Harry Beecher Stowe, Abraham Lincoln, and Douglas. Were you surprised there weren't more sonnets about the Civil War and emancipation, and especially not more sonnets about Black figures from the Civil War era?
That's a great question. It's a great question. Interestingly, in American literary history generally, there are just not a lot of sonnets about the Civil War, period. And there's something about the Civil War that doesn't lend itself to sonnets, right? Because the Civil War is a matter of taking sides, right? And sonnets are a matter of being a little bit ambivalent, right? So you can kind of imagine that something about which you're taking sides a poetic form that engages with, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, I have two thoughts about this, might not be appropriate, is interesting to me. So when there are anthologies of Civil War poetry in which there are very few sonnets, and it's only the most recent anthology, and I'm forgetting the name of it now, on Civil War poetry that came out in the 90s, that finally a Black poet is included, and that's Douglas's version of Robert Gould Shaw. And his poem, unlike any other poet about Shaw, is the first poem, one of the only poems about him that suggests that maybe he died in vain, right? So, Dunbar is writing this in the 1990s, with this rise of lynching and the rise in race violence at the end of the century. And he writes this poem, and it's like, what would you think about what's going on now, Robert Gould Shaw? And I think, at the time, anybody else, what Black figures might have been recovered, it's a good question, and I'm not sure. I was surprised, and interestingly, there should be more. I'm trying to think of other figures. There were a lot of really bad sonnets written to Booker T. Washington, by the way. And one of the best ones is by Dunbar. And he's like the prow of some ongoing ship. And it's a really interesting sonnet that it doesn't have a volta, right? And it was, again, like, I'm going to write about this guy who just goes forward like this and doesn't stop to think about anything. And it's hilarious when you're reading it within the sonnet tradition.
Thank you. Kim Benston.
Oh my goodness, Kim Benston.
Yes.
Woo! He's in my book.
Writes, for such a visually, metrically, and structurally vivid form, the sonnet's aesthetic and ideological qualities are notoriously difficult to pin down. A telling element of this challenge, one that you touch upon quite strikingly in your reflections on the genre's thematic double consciousness, is the relation in the sonnet between the medium's formal subtleties and his psychological appeal, blending as it does the impulses for unity and discontinuity, repetition and variation, tension and resolution, passion and control. Such animated oppositions already suggest that the sonnet, rather than being the epitome of the master's house, is always already a crucible of experiment, critique, and potential subversion, especially in the speaking self. Do you see African American sonneteers exploiting the medium of self-refiguration in order to explore a mode of specifically Black consciousness that further complicates any notion of the sonnet as the master's form? And then he says, P.S. Thank you for such a scintillating presentation. Can't wait to read the book.
Excellent.
Wow,
Yay.
KB kicked it with that question, man. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the great literary critic, Kimberly Benston, whose first book was a senior essay at Yale, and it was on Amiri Baraka. He's my man, and he's, of course, the former president of Haverford College, and more importantly, a former fellow at the Du Bois Institute.
Excellent. More important than that is in my book. Actually, you're in my book. So I'm so excited that you're here. And yes, you just told me, you just explained the reason that you're in my book. Because yes, exactly. And the question also points out a kind of problem about the sonnet and about talking about the sonnet, right? So the knowledge required for your question, right, is deep knowledge of the sonnet's particular subtleties over time, and the notion of understanding what its modality does as imprisoning and critique and double consciousness and all of the extraordinary aspects that a sonnet can do in an audience. And I'm not just talking about a Black newspaper audience, but also an educational audience that just teaches the sonnet as like, okay, today we're doing a sestina, tomorrow we're doing a sonnet, the next day we're doing some haiku, right? And so there's the discontinuity between, so David Bromwich, for example, writes this great anthology recently, and I called him out on it, and I sent him a copy of my book of the sonnet and the history of the sonnet, all this stuff about how the sonnet and the subtleties, all the things that you're talking about, and has hardly any Black sonnets in it, right? And ends and just doesn't talk about this controversy of Black sonnets, of pushing down Black sonnets. It's just invisible. So all of the really interesting sonnet, all the interesting sonnet disputes that are happening about all the things that the sonnet can do, which is doing it in a Black poetry context, are invisible to all the folks that are writing the sonnets. So back to Skip's question of what do I want to see in the Black poetry canon, a reclamation of these Black sonnets. I also want sonnet scholarship to say, you know, you're kind of missing something big here, right? Because Black poets have really understood the critique that's inherent in that, the ambivalence, the dynamism between passion and constraint, right? All of that history is known better by Black poets, and I think beginning with Douglass, right, and then couple of others through the Harlem Renaissance, and to Gwendolyn Brooks, and to Hayden, right, and to Margaret Walker in her great sonnet on Malcolm X, right, and then to Rita Dove, who reclaims the sonnets, and Kamanyaka, and then moving into the 20th century with Native Guard, with Natasha Trethewey. All of that is there. So amazing. Thank you for that question. And I actually want to reread the question in written form so I can, if you can send it to me, Krishna, or if we can be in touch, Kim. So thank you. I'm really grateful for your presence here.
Yes, we can send you a copy of the question.
Thank you.
Tom will. Yes.
Did David respond? David Bromwich, did he respond to your?
Oh, not yet. Not yet. He will. I mean, it's interesting. There's been, first of all, I'm grateful to be here. There's been absolute silence in my book, and I understand it's a pandemic year and it only came out in January, but it's not, Cave Canon is paying no attention, right? It's not being embraced by the Black poetry world, and it's not being embraced by the white poetry world. Right? It's in this place that's kind of scoldy on both sides.
No, you should send a copy signed to each Black poet whose sonnet you included.
I did, right.
Oh, you did? Okay. It just takes time. You know, it's a scholarly book, scholarly publications come out slowly. So don't worry about that. You've written a great book. Besides, you have tenure.
No, I mean, it's not a complaint about that. It's that, like, I used to give this talk and I would give it and there'd be some Miltonists here, right, in the audience. And I would be, show some of the Claude McKay sonnets and like, do you not understand how this is really engaging with Milton? And I'm like, yeah, so why aren't you writing about this, right? And then you give the sonnet over here. It's like, why are you talking about these white forms? Like, why is this so important to you, white lady, right? And so it's been in this kind of funny place. So thank you.
But that happens often with pioneering scholarship. So people will catch up to you. You're just ahead, and these poets will. They'll respond. Somebody will review it. It's important. Just quickly, who did Bromwich include? which Black sonnets? I mean, is it an anthology or a critical?
It's an anthology, but it's an anthology that gets at, and I think I end a chapter. I think I end the second chapter in my book by calling him out a little bit, because I'll just read this. He says, Bronnet's recent sonnet anthology exemplifies the sanitizing project in American sonnets, casting aside Black sonnets that signify on and contend with the sonnet traditions, interventions that the sonnet tradition clearly welcomes. Bromwitz's conservative biases are clear in his claim that Frost is the author of the best sonnets written by anyone who is not Shakespeare. And Bromwich's first example is Frost's The Silken Tent, whose debt to sonnet history. And he reads The Silken Tent, which is all about bondage and all about being constrained and all about what does it mean to be bound by the sonnet form, right? And he just doesn't see that it has anything to do with bondage in American history, right? So, yes. But feel free to nudge him if you want. He's a Yaley, right?
We were not only in the same class, we were two of the 12 scholars of the house. So I've known David since 72, 73. And he's brilliant,
I love his work. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, he's a genius, you know. And I quote him in the Black Church in the last chapter on the Sublime, because he's written, his book on Burke is, you know, a masterpiece, without a doubt. Christina, please. I want to tell everybody I have to bail at 1:30 for another Zoom interview about the Black Church, but this is riveting, but keep going, Chris. I could go listen all day. It's great.
I agree. Kim Benson just wrote back. He says that response was awesome. Thank you. And he's going to write to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
I'll move on to a couple of questions by a current fellow, William Pruitt, and perhaps you can combine the answers.
He's superstar graduate student, Hollis, superstar. He's
Excellent.
A future.
He says, Du Bois's 1903 modernist tour de force, The Souls of Black Folks, famously has 14 chapters, formally suggesting the double consciousness of the seventh son. Or is it the seventh son's second sight? Though obviously not a sonnet, is this canonical work influenced by the sonnet tradition? Please describe the discourse between genres in African American literature that the sonnet tradition participates in. And his second related question is, I suspect that so many contemporary African American writers reject the sonnet, partly because they no longer feel compelled to demonstrate their skills using those forms privileged in the Western European and white US literary tradition. Could you please explain how white supremacy shapes literary tastes, and how should future writers of all races subvert white supremacy's dominance of literary discourse?
Two amazing questions, so thank you. First of all, the 14 chapters. I mean, when you part of the occupational hazard of focusing on sonnets is that you see 14 everywhere. It's like, oh, it's got to be a sonnet, right? You just always, it's got to be a sonnet. So that's, of course. And you know, he has that those lines. I'm forgetting the chapter when he talks about beauty, right? When he talks about the songs, and then he talks about the cathedral and Chartres, and I'm forgetting the other one, but he, you know, clearly his notion of beauty is global. And so, and he himself is fairly conservative. And I went back and I looked at his, at the newspapers when he was an undergraduate at Fisk. And even though he wasn't publishing sonnets, I really hoped to find one. He kept publishing sonnets and asking for sonnets. And there's just sonnets all over the crisis, which is really kind of interesting. Partly to give people work, but also because they fit. The question about white supremacy is a really hard question because, you know, it's no doubt I mean, this is, the sonnet blueprint is a white form from 12th century Italy. And it's Roland Green has this great book, I'm forgetting the name of it, when he talks about the sonnet, the way the sonnet came to America and the Spanish sonnet writers, and the idea that the sonnet was in the Spanish language. And, I talk a little bit about Nicolas Guillen, the Cuban sonnet writer. Langston Hughes said, I've never written a sonnet, even though he wrote several, and he translated all of Nicolas Guillen's sonnets and included them in his anthologies. But Green proposes that the metaphysics of the sonnet form of having but not owning was important for colonization, right? Of after 1492, the idea that, we're coming to this new world, but we're not really owning it, that there's a kind of metaphysics there that made the sonnet form appropriate for colonization. Which I gesture to, and I read his book. It's really interesting. It's more about that history of the sonnet than the Black Sonnet. But there's something interesting there about which is a really dark and convenient view of the sonnet as allowing the metaphysics of owning, or the metaphysics of ravishing, right? That it is a sonnet that allows you to talk about ravishing something, but saying, but I'm over here. I'm not really ravishing. And reading that tradition as a white supremacist tradition, I think is really provocative. And I mean, there's so much more work to do on the relationship of the sonnet form and Black poetry in the 21st century, particularly. That yes, more questions and more addressing of questions like that. It's a great question.
Greg, you have a question. Would you like to pose it? I see it in the chat.
So, yeah, that the question that I asked earlier, I think I'd rather just bring up Martha Patterson's question here.
Okay, sure.
She's asking, have you looked at the sonnets in the Negro world? Can you speak more about the cultural work of sonnets within the context of Black newspapers? This is kind of my question, but asked so much better. Thank you, Martha. How do these sonnets speak to other content on the page or the editorial position of the paper?
Well, it's a great, I went through just every single issue of Negro World and Black Digest, and it was really hilarious. And I have in the book some examples like Daughtry Long's Gingerbread Mama and some of these other things. There's like this sonnet Pan Africa, a sonnet where the content, the essays would be like new Black forms, new Black poetry, Black arts, all of this stuff. And then you'd turn the page and there'd be a sonnet, right? And I'd be like, am I the only one noticing this? So, I went right through all of these, and it was really fun. And there's a couple of, like, I think Eugene Redmond had a long essay that I refer to all over the place in Black World, where he's like, we need to remember the sonnets, because these sonnets are really important. And that was the only big piece supporting the sonnet there.
Was Martha, it's the Negro Digest, which became Black World.
Right.
I want to ask Martha, is that the Negro World that you're talking about? Because she asked for Negro World. Was that Marcus Garvey's Negro World, Martha? Is that what Garvey's newspaper was called?
Because I went through those too. Sorry, I misheard. Yeah.
No, I don't know. Martha, can you just unmute and talk?
I don't know if she's able to, but she can answer it.
Oh, okay.
Marcus. Yes. So Marcus Garvey, I also went through those. That is full.
Isn't it called Negro World? I think she was referring to that.
Yeah. Yes.
Martha, affirm or deny,
She says yes.
Yes. Okay, so, and there are tons of very bad sonnets and I don't mean bad, just, kind of like high blown sonnets in Marcus Garvey's paper, really interesting ones too. A lot of sonnets to Africa. Again, this sort of background tradition, sonnets to Marcus Garvey, sonnets, I think I included a couple of them in the book, but there were a lot. All the time, and it was really hard to actually find out who they were. Doing the work, as Greg knows well, as everybody knows well, that who is this person? Like the sonnet that I just showed in to Haile Selassie, Sonnet to Selassie in Chicago Defender, this guy named Jonathan Cover. I had to find him. It's a pseudonym for this guy that worked for the government, who after he retired wrote memoirs of a Negro who worked for the government, and why he was publishing. So just finding out who all these people are. There's so much work to be done.
Well, Garvey wrote a lot of poems. In fact, I think it was Tony Martin, formerly at Wellesley, who collected Garvey's. I'm not sure Garvey collected them himself, but Tony Martin edited a collection of Garvey's poetry. And I was in a discussion with editors of the Oxford English Dictionary, and they asked me to consider editing a Black version, a dictionary of African American usage of English and coinage based on historical principles. And one of the editors, we were in a Zoom meeting 2 weeks ago, and she said, yes, we've identified the first usage of the word cool, in the Black sense. And I said, oh, really? When was that? She said, I don't know, 1926 or 1936. I go, no, Marcus Garvey published a poem in the teens, I think, called Keep Cool, Baby, Keep Cool,
Wow.
Yeah, so Garvey loved poetry, but he had the same education, I guess, as Claude McKay. I mean, the English-based education
You're milking your Wordsworth, all of that.
Yeah. Anyway, I have to Zoom. You guys keep going. Bravo.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's dedicated to you. Bye.
Okay, I love you. Thank you for doing that. It's the first time that ever happened, and I'm deeply touched. And now I will read it, I promise. And let me know when Bromwich writes. I'm interested.
Okay.
Thank you, Greg. Bye, Chris.
Bye.
Yeah, I've looked through Marcus Garvey. I just, if it wasn't a sonnet, I sort of put it aside. But yes, it's a really, really rich database.
I'm going to go to another question by another current fellow, Alessandra De Mayo. She says, thank you so much for such a great talk. Your study on the African American sonnet closes a circle for me as a scholar of literature and a Sicilian. Since the form was invented by Jacopo da Lentini from Lentini, Sicily, one of the first poets who wrote in vulgar or vernacular form, the linguistic margins, that is, in the linguistic margins. Do you happen to know if any of the most contemporary African American sonnets you read for us, or even the older ones, have been set to music or turned into songs? There's a sonic aspect, intrinsic even in the etymology of the term, that would make me want to hear them set to music.
It's a good question. See, the sonnets turned to music is kind of an interesting issue because iambic pentameter isn't turned to music very well. Like when Benjamin Britten in the War Requiem uses Wilfred Owen's iambic pentameter, he kind of messes up the whole sonnet, in my view. Messes up the iambic pentameter in order to make it fit into this modernist music. In trying to write this book, I decided I needed to know how to write sonnets. So I needed to know what the appeal was. And it turns out I'm okay. I'm not great. I've had a number of my sonnets published. And I had a number of composers put my sonnets to music as a kind of composition expert exercise back when I was at Johns Hopkins. And once again, I saw the actual problem of turning iambic pentameter into music. Like, I didn't realize that this was an issue. And again, I'm just bringing my own experience to the table that, the blues is tetrameter or tetrameter, trimeter. Amazing Grace, right? It's that ballad form, works really well. Iambic pentameter just doesn't work that well, or if it does, not in ways that that composers are used to. So the answer is, I wish there were more. And I have not seen more, and I'd be interested in more because I've been interested in this question for a while, but I don't have an answer to it.
Thank you. We're nearing the end of our time. Greg, do you have any final thoughts or even questions?
I just want to thank Hollis for this extraordinary contribution to our literature. This is an important book, and I'm so fascinated that the reviews are not coming yet, and Skip's response about that. This is, I love the reclamation work that you've done here, and that gift you've had for archival work all along. Thank you. This is a book that our audience needs to read. It's absolutely splendid.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for Krishna and Abby and Skip and Tom for giving me the opportunity to talk about something I obviously love so much. I spent, again, 15 years writing this book. And so, and Abby's sister helped me in the proofreading and the finalizing it when I was at the National Humanities Center, for which I am very, very, very grateful. So it was a long time coming, and I could talk about it forever. So thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm delighted.
Well, we're honored. This is an exciting and amazing book.
It was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much.
Great questions, great answers. Thank you so much.
Yay. Thank you so much.